There we go. So tonight we'll be hearing from three speakers. First, we'll have Sarah Sharp, who's one of the co-authors of the paper. And then we will be hearing from Peter Bulling, who's the biodiversity campaigner here at the Conservation Council. And then we'll be hearing from Kat McGilk, who is the coordinator at the Ginninderra Catchment Group. So we're really pleased to have those different perspectives speaking about enhancing biodiversity and protecting biodiversity in the ACT. For those of you who may have joined later, just letting you know we're doing the three speakers and then we'll do time for questions following that. So first, I'm really pleased to be welcoming Sarah Sharp to speak. Sarah is a plant ecologist with a strong interest in applying scientific knowledge to guide practical ecological outcomes on the ground. She's worked as an ecologist with the ACT government between 1991 and 2009, and mostly in relation to conservation of grassy ecosystems, including facilitating listing natural temperate grasslands as a threatened ecological community under ACT and Commonwealth legislation. Thank you to Sarah for that excellent work. So as a consultant for 12 years, Sarah undertook surveys, provided conservation and management advice, and established and ran citizen science vegetation monitoring of grassy ecosystems. As a community volunteer since 2009, Sarah advocates through Friends of Grasslands and the Conservation Council to protect, maintain and enhance grassy ecosystems. So Sarah is going to be giving an overview of what the Biodiversity Network is. So welcome, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Elle, for the introduction. Could you go to the next slide, please? So our outcome is a tenure blind framework, and so that we've got cohesive, cooperative and collaborative conservation across the ACT. Thanks, Elle. Primarily within this, this was a very fortuitous quote that I found actually when we did an advocacy work submission on the draft territory plan and district strategies. This is an upfront statement that I think it behoves us all to remember, keep in our mind that protection of heritage and biodiversity values is actually mandated by law in the ACT, and this is in a planning document, should be a primary consideration in all planning and development considerations. And I think this sits importantly under what we're trying to achieve, because this is what we are trying to achieve in the Biodiversity Network. Thanks. The context in which we're looking at this is that areas of conservation significance occur across connected landscape within the ACT in an ecological sense, but politically they're managed as small units. And the small units are nature reserves, that's the numbers 1, 2, 3 and so on that you see in there. Urban open space areas, which is the A, Bs and Cs. Road easements, which aren't marked, they tend to be too small. Horse paddocks, like outside Hall, is a really important one. This area here, by the way, is, it's northwest Belconnen, so includes part of Fraser, part of Spence, part of Flynn, and the sort of and Hall area. So it also includes TSRs, leased land, and then Commonwealth land. So the area E and F in there is the CSIRO Ginninderra research station. So essentially landscape is tenure blind, except where it's been destroyed in terms of development. And you can see through this map the important linkages between these areas, and despite the fact that they're being managed by many different organisations. Thanks, Elle. Important to think about why we're doing it. There are legislative requirements to protect and manage matters of national and territory environmental significance. Territory environmental significance matters tend to have been ignored over the years when the ACT government and states have had to actually look after matters of national environmental significance. There are societal expectations of land custodianship and land care. It's a means to strategically apply government programs. I think a lot of us have seen some fantastic programs developed, but they don't seem to work cohesively as much as they should be and as practically as they should be. It's important to encourage true partnerships between government, Indigenous custodians, landholders and other community. There's no doubt that it will improve ecological function, increase climate resilience, and we really hope and believe that it will provide economic savings through cooperative management. Thanks, Elle. So the basis for our work has been looking at the IUCN, International Union for Conservation and Nature, and there are two categories applied already within the ACT, which is national parks and nature reserves. There's another one that I think it was about 1920 it sort of came on the scene in the ACT, other effective area-based conservation measures. And this is designed to pick up areas of land that are under existing land uses which may well continue, but where conservation is at least a secondary objective, if not a primary objective. Coincidentally, the Commonwealth has just put out a draft paper which is due tomorrow on guidelines and principles of this being applied in the ACT, so timing couldn't be better. And the slide I put in there is there's a cemetery, there's rural land, there's a horse paddock, and there's the sort of the village of Hall beyond that. So horse paddock, and just out of that picture is also travelling stock reserve, TSR, travelling stock reserve. Thanks, Elle. What we want to achieve is that the city really genuinely embraces the biodiverse landscape setting. We feel that it's important to recognise and acknowledge that land in every tenure may well be just as important as land that's in a nature reserve. It's important that biodiversity is considered consistently in planning outcomes, and we would like to see any land that is part of this network is actually quarantined from development. We want to see that they're properly managed for ecological outcomes, at the same time as seeing that compatible land uses can still continue. So a classic and easy example is on a urban open space where you've got a recreational area, primarily a recreational area, but there's an important area that has conservation values. So that area would be still within the urban open space, but would be managed for its conservation values rather than just for recreation, with conservation being a sideline to that. We believe absolutely and utterly that the change can only be achieved through cooperative participation of everybody, landholders, government and community. Okay, thanks. So we see that as working in partnership. So it's a matter of identifying where these conservations are, protecting them through appropriate legislation, developing and implementing best practice management. And we feel that it's important to have a liaison and support team overseeing this to to work towards actually achieving this outcome. And it's important that of course, the public awareness, so that people both on in lessees don't feel threatened by this. What we feel is very important, that any lessee should not have this imposed on them, but that they enter into this completely voluntarily, but that they receive the sort of support that they require in order to manage these areas for a responsibility that they didn't necessarily mean to take on. So the example there, the picture is of a different area, National Capital Authority land, Stirling Ridge, Gurrabungdara, and so the area has been divided up. So management guidelines to actually guide how things happen on the ground are really important. So everybody is working together towards this. Thanks, Elle. So we just feel that it will actually guide better practices for habitat restoration and habitat conservation in the ACT if everyone is working together. It's just a simple message and bleeding obvious, but I think we can do it a lot better than we're doing at the moment. Thanks, Elle. That's it.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Sarah, and going through the framework for the Biodiversity Network and also outlining the benefits of implementing the Biodiversity Network. It was a really excellent overview. Welcome to those of you who've joined us a little bit later. It's wonderful to have you here. So as an overview of what's happening tonight, we're hearing from 3 speakers who are presenting an overview and benefits and some areas that can be improved with enhancing the biodiversity in the ACT region, and specifically through the Biodiversity Network, which is a proposal and policy from the Conservation Council Biodiversity Working Group and Friends of Grasslands. We've just heard from Sarah Sharp, and now we'll be hearing from Peter Bulling. So you may recognise Peter. She's the biodiversity campaigner at the Conservation Council, and she's been working closely with the community to help draft the Biodiversity Network paper. And Peter is an environmental scientist and activist with an honours degree in law. So thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Elle. Good evening, everybody. I hope you've all had a really lovely day. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'd just like to start by talking a little bit about the background of this paper. So this paper is the culmination of many, many volunteer hours by the Conservation Council's Biodiversity Working Group and by Friends of Grassland. And in particular, it was a lot of hours and work by my friend Sarah Sharp, who you just heard from. So we've had a lot of really positive reception since launching this paper in February. And the fact that we are still getting, people coming to talk to us on their Wednesday night to hear about this paper, I think is a massive testament to all of Sarah's hard work. So I think that's just a really important place to set the scene. So I've been asked to talk to you all tonight a little bit about the policy and legislative reform that will be required to realise the Biodiversity Network. In other ways, what needs to be written down so that the Biodiversity Network can get up and running. This is a very hot and spicy topic at the moment because, as I'm sure many of you know, the ACT government is currently looking at reforming our planning systems in the ACT. So we just finished the first round of public consultation for that, but a lot of these conversations are still happening and will continue to be had over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. Now, I know that not everybody here will be a law reform nerd like me, and I dare say that you might actually find policy and law a little bit boring, but in the context of the Biodiversity Network, it's incredibly important. And that's because the Biodiversity Network paper is written ecologically and not legally.
Oh, so quick on the uptake, I'm in.
And therefore, its implementation will require broad scale change across a variety of instruments so that any time a law or a policy interacts with the environment, it asks the question, is there something here that we need to be conserving? Is there something here that needs to be managed?
Is that coming from you?
Oh, sorry, Gary's iPad. Could you just pop yourself on mute? And Elle, could you change the slide for me, please? Thank you. Thanks, Gary. So this question will have to be really intimately involved in every single planning and land management decision that we make. So for example, when do we mow a verge or a roadside? Do we mow it at all? What kind of species do we plant in our local parks, and where is the best place to build a road, and how do we build it? So talking specifically, these changes will have to occur in large part in the Planning Act, the Territory Plan, the new district strategies, which are that pink one in the corner there, and there's 9 of those, and in the Nature Conservation Act. Now, these are just the high-level instruments. In order for the biodiversity network to be truly realised, these changes will have to trickle down into all policies and work practices, but we'll get to that in just a minute. So reform of these instruments in particular will have to be broad scale. And by that, I mean, it's about a lot more than just amending the objects of the Act or amending the objects of the plan and calling it a day. So for example, the technical specifications of the Territory Plan in particular is where I see a lot of the rubber will hit the road for the biodiversity network to ensure that there's these entrenched standards for things like buffer and light pollution and noise pollution. Now, this kind of reform, particularly in these big acts and then trickling down through all the policies that sit underneath them, is not an easy task whatsoever. But in this circumstance in particular at the moment, we just do not have the luxury of apathy. We're currently living in an extinction crisis. Our environment is in the worst state that it's ever been, and the plants and animals that we love are seeing unprecedented decline. If we don't act now and make changes like the biodiversity network, we will really risk losing the nature that makes the territory so special and that our livelihoods all depend on. So it's a big ask, but there's also a big risk on the line here. Luckily for us, there has also never been a better time to make these changes. Could I have the next slide, please, Elle? Thank you. So as I mentioned before briefly, we're currently undergoing a planning system review and reform project in the ACT, which means that a really large chunk of the instruments that I previously mentioned are up for review. I've highlighted those ones in yellow here that are currently up for a review as part of the Planning Review and Reform Project. The Nature Conservation Act that's sitting up the top right there, we also anticipate will be coming up for review within the next 12 to 18 months, but as a separate project. So I think, oh, sorry, I've lost my voice a little bit there. I think at this point, we've talked a lot about these acts and what we need to do and what they look like. I think it's fair to give a little bit into background into how this reform and how we discuss this reform in the paper. It is a very lengthy paper, and I expect that not everybody has read it. But when you read the Biodiversity Network paper, you'll notice that some of the language used to describe exactly what this reform looks like is a little bit vague. This was done intentionally. So for example, we talk about protecting remnants through appropriate legislation, and we propose a framework. This language was really all deliberate because the way that these laws operate and these policies interact is incredibly complex. And as we've just talked about, they're regularly changing, particularly at the moment when we're looking at all of these reforms. So we don't really know how everything will interact in the next sort of 6 months to a year from now, but the Biodiversity Network paper is an outcomes-focused ecological paper. While we're not steadfast about how our guidelines and principles are put into place, we would like to see them fully resourced, designed collaboratively with the community, designed to provide long-term protection, and we would also like to make sure that they're not inconsistent with any laws and policies. Now, these may sound like very basic asks, but I'm sure anybody who's been working in this space for a while or volunteering in this space for a while can agree that this doesn't always happen when we're looking at reform, particularly when we're looking at reform on such a massive scale. With all of that being said, in the paper, we do throw in our 2 cents, as everybody does when it comes to planning law, about how we think these reforms should look like, or what we think they should look like. So first, we propose the creation of new nature reserves and the incorporation of high value remnants on unleased land into existing reserves where possible. So a great example of where this could take place is Blewett's Block out in Denman Prospect. Now, Blewett's Block is this beautiful area of incredibly diverse woodland that's currently gazetted as sort of a mishmash of urban open space and future urban area. This is incredibly significant because the diversity at this site has been equated to Black Mountain, which is our reserve with the highest level of protection in the ACT. So going to Sarah's point, what we're saying, we have this area that's incredibly diverse, really beautiful, but it hasn't been gazetted in any sort of reserve and isn't being managed for protection and for conservation. So through the biodiversity network, this site could be included into the existing Molonglo River Reserve or given reserve status entirely of its own. The second step that's outlined in the paper is that the conservation areas, these conservation areas should be established at sites with high biodiversity out values where they cannot be included in existing reserves. Now, these conservation areas are what Sarah was talking about the OECM areas as they're categorized under sort of the IUCN international law terms. Now, we've seen a really incredible popularity of this term of the OECMs used lately, which is really great because it comes at a really important time for the biodiversity network, because that was one of the pillars that we really built this paper upon, or Sarah built this paper upon in particular. And so having the idea of this vessel of an other environmental conservation management, I think, is that it, Sarah? It's something along those lines. So having this sort of resurgence of this principle as a vessel to see the biodiversity network fulfilled is really important. So when we're talking about these conservation areas, we're thinking about things like roadsides, verges, or public parks. So the tools where particularly these first two steps, or the instruments where these first two steps will have to be implemented, is in the Territory Plan and the Planning Act, which, as I said before, are both coincidentally under review as we speak. The next sort of step that we see is the creation of these collaborative agreements between landholders and government. So we propose the implementation of these agreements, and they need to include provisions for financial and logistic support to facilitate conservation while also enabling other land uses to continue. Thank you, Steve, for putting the other effective area-based management in the chat. It's a long acronym and thank you very much. So, as I said, these agreements will provide for ongoing land uses to continue whilst also managing these conservation values. So this is a really important principle of the biodiversity network paper. The biodiversity network has sort of been designed to exist in the planning system that we have currently as a layer or a zone that sits on top of existing provisions. And it does this so that, you know, a roadside can continue to be a roadside and a farm can continue to be a farm, but it means that the little pockets of native grassland and native woodland in these areas can be properly managed, and they will be properly managed while these other land uses coexist. Without sending you all to sleep, I think that that is the crux of the legislative and policy change that we need to see in order to implement the biodiversity network, but it's definitely not the end of the entire reform needed. So we've recommended a support and liaison team be created to aid in the coordination of the biodiversity network, promote knowledge sharing between government, landholders, and community. So we really see this as being a very collaborative framework, a very collaborative way to look at our land management holistically moving forward. To go along with that, we've also proposed a public awareness campaign to ensure that everybody in the ACT understands how our landscape functions as a whole. Now, last but definitely not least, I'd like to remind you that particularly at the moment when we are in this stage of flux with a lot of these big pieces of policy and legislation, the things that we advocate for and the ideas that we advocate for will shape the territory for generations to come. It really is up to us to take these very random pieces of paper that may not be interesting and potentially don't mean a lot to a lot of us, but that we can use them to create a really positive legacy, one of living in harmony with nature and not in competition with it. I hope that tonight, and by reading the paper, you'll understand that the Biodiversity Network is a really positive legacy to leave our city. Thanks again, everybody, for coming along tonight, and I look forward to answering your questions in a little while.
Thanks so much, Peter, for giving us an overview of those legislative and policy changes that are required to implement the Biodiversity Network, and also for acknowledging that we are in a biodiversity crisis and that this is incredibly crucial for ensuring that we protect biodiversity for the future and we leave a really positive legacy. And yes, it may appear like boring paperwork, boring legislation for some people, but it really brings it back home when you're looking at, well, what does this mean for our region going forwards and its amazing, unique and threatened nature. So I hope that this will be implemented so we can protect it. I also wanted to echo your thoughts about the huge contribution that Sarah and other volunteers have made to writing the paper. It was really wonderful that you acknowledged that. And also, yeah, echo what you were saying about the reception being so positive to the paper from community and from government, which has been brilliant. And many of you tonight may have some questions on that. I think we had a few more latecomers, so welcome. We are going through presentations from 3 presenters. We had Sarah, Peter, and now we will hear from Kat, and then we'll have time for questions and then a few next steps on the paper. So next we're going to be hearing from Kat, who is the Executive Officer at Ginninderra Catchment Group. Kat has a background in conservation biology and landscape restoration. She's been involved with Landcare for over 10 years, working with many organisations, including universities, CSIRO, Greening Australia, and many community groups. Some very excellent work, Kat. So many different groups you've been a part of and so much experience to share. So Kat's work in environmental restoration focuses on broad community engagement and fostering partnerships between community, business and government, aiming to bring together stakeholders to make Australia's bush capital a world-leading city for environmental conservation and sustainability. And that's very much what the Biodiversity Network is aiming to do, really bring together stakeholders, community, government for protecting our bush capital and making it a world-leading here. So thank you so much, Kat. We'd love to hear from you about the on-ground implications of the Biodiversity Network.
Brilliant, thanks, Elle. And thanks to Peter and Sarah for providing that background to everybody that's here today. I'll take this opportunity just to talk to you all a bit about how the Biodiversity Network can fit in with community environmental volunteering more broadly. I'll also go over some of our perhaps current land management failings in lieu of something like the Biodiversity Network, which obviously the government has not been operating under, up until now. And I'll also provide some examples on perhaps how we can look at doing conservation a bit better on the ground. So just to, thanks for that. Elle might skip to the next slide. Brilliant, thanks. So this is a map here of all the current land care groups that we have in the ACT. So, I mean, from looking at this, you can see it's a very broad network. I think there's well over 80 groups now, covering pretty much most of the ACT with a bit less groups down in the south. And many members in these groups, there's quite a few of you here today, I can see. have extensive experience and backgrounds like Sarah. They've got many, many years experience working in the conservation and biodiversity space, working with specific species or with specific threatened ecosystems. And I think more importantly, within the Landcare network and volunteers with groups like Friends of Grasslands, we all work across different land tenures. So when we go out to look and care for the biodiversity at a site, we don't really care whether it's parksland or if it's a road verge. If it's got biodiversity value, which I guess all sites do to some degree, the people in this community network will be able to advocate for it in a way that I guess, unfortunately, government is just not resourced to do. So I think it's really important when we go into looking at biodiversity conservation, we consider the huge value that this network has overall for our local biodiversity and for government as well. So I think perhaps we might go to the next slide, I think, Elle. So I think one of the really important things that we can gain from a paper like the Biodiversity Network is a really detailed review on all the current biodiversity and habitat values that might be held within one site. So some sites might be home to a threatened species or an ecosystem. They might hold important value as a habitat corridor for terrestrial species or birds or aquatic species as well. And I think that this biodiversity network really helps for community environmental volunteers, but also for government to look past the superficial issue of land tenure and see what is the actual value of this space, of this land, of this patch and the species that are in it, and how we can adopt our land management practices to not only protect and conserve the biodiversity values here, but to actually do as best we can to try and enhance them. I think we're often get quite bogged down in protection issues that we're often not in a space where we can really look at actually being able to go out and improve these sites. But I think the Biodiversity Network provides a really great tool to actually allow us to take that step towards conservation and also looking at improving biodiversity at these sites. So just looking at these 4 sites we've got here. So I've used these as some examples of some current issues we have with land management, mostly due to issues with planning and also different land management across the land tenures. So you can see up there on the top left, we've got an area that's, it's a bit hard to tell, but it's actually native grassland there that has unfortunately been mowed quite severely, which I'm sure a lot of people here who have been involved with FOG would be well aware that this is an issue we face time and time again across remnant patches of native grassland of all different sizes. And I think this comes down to an issue, unfortunately, with land tenure and not every area in ACT government having the knowledge and the resources to be able to appropriately manage these sites, which is an issue that the Biodiversity Network can actually help us overcome this and provide a useful tool for land managers to try and ensure that these areas are better protected. And then also you can see there on the top right, this is also a native grassland. This site is actually listed as critically endangered natural temperate grassland. But unfortunately, a few years ago, somebody thought it would be a great idea to go and plant some oak seedlings into it, which is very unfortunate. They've, as you can see, they've grown to at least a few meters tall there. And eventually we will be taking these out, but it just goes to show that the current framework that government is using for their land management is sort of failing to pick up on the key biodiversity values at site, and not just threatening the biodiversity values that are there, but also essentially just wasting money, really, to put an oak tree like that in a space where it's clearly not supposed to be. And then we've also got, so at the bottom right here, we've got a natural temperate grassland in Lawson, and you can see there, I think this is a bit of an example of perhaps failings in the planning system here. So we've got urban development that is going right up to the edge and has actually resulted in the destruction of some natural temperate grasslands that are found at that site there. And this is definitely, as Peter was saying before, this is an issue that we're facing more and more as we see the urban sprawl of Canberra really spread out and look for more greenfields development. It's really critical now that we get these areas marked as protection zones regardless of their land tenure, so we don't face loss of more of these spaces to new urban developments. And then the last one there on the bottom left is a bit of a common example we have of woodland plantings in the ACT that were done a couple of decades ago, and they're to maybe the average observer, it might look like a nice woodland ecosystem, but if you actually go and visit these sites, they're pretty devoid of biodiversity. So the understory is usually an exotic grassland. The trees are often mixed eucalypt species, not necessarily native to the ACT. And it really is quite devoid of bird life. There's no habitat complexity. There's no spaces for small birds to hide. There's really limited forage for them as well. So just another example of, I guess, perhaps government or individuals sort of working to try and do some sort of environmental restoration really without the background knowledge or that broader focus on biodiversity there. So maybe now to the next slide, please, Elle. Brilliant, thank you. So it's not all doom and gloom, and I just want to focus on the negative things. So I'll show you guys now some examples of some techniques that we've used to achieve some positive biodiversity outcomes within the ACT. So this is an example of a natural temperate grassland site just downhill from the site with the unfortunate oak tree planting. So the site, before we went in and did some scattered forb plantings, was, as you can see on the left, quite heavily mown, as we often see. But by going in with community volunteers and establishing some forb plantings with the guards, as you can see in the photo on the right, we've actually been able to protect this site from mowing. It's a bit hard to tell with my photos there, but the site is now pretty dominated by kangaroo grass, as well as some chrysocephalums and a few other key grassland species there. So with not too much effort, we planted maybe 100 or 200 forbs in there, but we've actually managed to protect a much more broader ecosystem that exists around those planted forbs as well. So an example of a positive outcome that we've had there with that pretty small scale resource input there. Could you put to the next slide, please, Elle? Brilliant, thank you. So this is an example here of a riparian restoration project that we've done at Croke Place in Evatt. So the slide on the left shows the recent plantings of a mix of native sedge and poa. I think it was a carrots and poa grass that we've put in there. The group worked to remove all the exotic grasses that were growing in this little trial plot. And you can see there on the right, so this is in probably just over a year. Sorry, it's a little bit hard to see with the photos, but that stand there is now dominated by the native grass species. So the group has actually successfully managed to restore to a more natural state the native grasses that would have existed in that ecosystem before. So it's a small trial to start with, but in 12 months, we can see that the groups had quite a significant impact after just 1 or 2 2-hour working bees as well. And next slide, please, Elle. So this here is a fantastic example. So this is our Emu Creek site in Belconnen, right next to Belconnen Oval. So it's quite close to the city centre. This is a before and after photo of the group's work over about 2.5 years. So you can see the slide on the left there. It's pretty standard of our urban open space in Canberra. We've got some planted utes. There's a couple of fox gun remnants outside the photo view. But then the understory is just heavily mown grasses. And eventually, with enough years of mowing, the exotic species will unfortunately grow to outcompete the native species, and will be left with a mostly exotic grassland dominated. But luckily the group, through some very clever planning, was able to get some shrub and ground cover plantings done. And you can see over there on the right, the habitat complexity there has just increased quite significantly in just a couple of years. And even if you get a chance to visit the site, the diversity of birds that you hear at that site now compared to just a couple of years ago is absolutely beautiful. They're getting a lot more smaller birds come in. They also get a lot of superb parrots, and they're getting a lot less noisy miners as well, which is fantastic for the local bird diversity, and also more reptile and insect species as well. And next slide, thanks, Al. And then we've got here another site at Emu Creek in Belconnen. So the slide, the photo on the left there with the mulch was again another exotic heavily mown grassland. But the group has gone through and planted maybe 400 or 500 native ground cover and small shrubs and a couple of trees, which you can see in, I think this site would be less than 2 years actually. You can see the photo on the right there. The shrubs are really starting to come in, and even some of the trees have grown up well over 1 meter tall now. And in another year or two, hopefully we'll start to get a bit more wildlife diversity in there. We're not quite there yet with this site. But even just the increased diversity of plants, then you can see compared to what was previously maybe 3 or 4 exotic grass species and a few other herbaceous weeds. The increase in that habitat diversity to that space is, well, yeah, significant, and will keep going into the future as well. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, El. And lastly, so this is a bit of a new one that we've had here. So this is not necessarily a restoration project, but this here is, I guess, an advocacy campaign that our Belconnen Land Care groups had to try and encourage ACT government to do something with a disused dryland oval. So the image on the left is my terribly designed wetland image that you can see there that we used to petition ACT government to put a wetland at that site, thanks to the group convener, John Chacon. And then the slide we've got there on the right is actually the Healthy Waterways approved project plan for an urban wetland at that site. So in the space of 3 years, we've gone from what was, I guess, a dream for local residents and people in that group to an actual multi-million-dollar project that will be hopefully constructed in the next 6 to 18 months at the site. And I'm sure you could all imagine the increase in diversity at that site there, looking at all the different habitat features we've got with trees and ponds, will be significantly greater than what we had with a poorly managed dryland oval. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that, El. I'm not sure if I've got another slide after that. So yeah, hopefully that was informative for everybody to see some of the ways that community advocacy and involvement can try and influence on-ground land management. And using the biodiversity network, I think, can really help us amplify and align our efforts across community and government and local residents as well. So we can try and see these programs rolled out across multiple sites across Canberra and really expand on this conservation effort.
Thanks so much, Kat, for that presentation and outlining the on-the-ground implications for the biodiversity network, and yeah, especially those challenges that you've been facing. You described that really, really clearly. I was inspired by the Emu Creek example, the 2.5-year one. Was incredible, just the difference in the site. So thank you for sharing that with us, and yeah, all the best with continuing that work. Hopefully once we get the biodiversity network implemented, we can see more of that across our region. So thanks so much for your work, Kat. we have heard from all of our speakers now, so a really big thank you to Sarah, Peter and Kat for making time this evening just to go over different aspects of the Biodiversity Network with us. To everyone who's joined us tonight as well, you can read the full paper on the Conservation Council website, and I'll share that link with you in the chat shortly. But now we're going to be moving into a Q&A session, questions and discussion. So how we're going to run this session is I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. So you can do that through Zoom. If you go under your video, there is a spot there that's it's an option for emojis, and then there's also an option to raise hand. If that doesn't work for you, you can also just write your name in the chat box, and then I'll be keeping a list of everyone who has questions and coming to you as we go. And if I can ask, just people to stay on mute when they're not speaking, just makes it a lot easier when we're on Zoom. Otherwise you get the funny lag in sound or the accidental bumping of conversations together. So it does make it smoother. Peter has just shared the Biodiversity Network paper in the chat. Thank you for doing that, Peter. So that's where you can go and read the full paper. There's some really excellent examples in there and case studies, which I'd highly recommend you reading if you don't want to read the whole paper itself. So who would like to ask a question of one of our excellent speakers? We're all being very shy tonight. Maybe it's different being on Zoom. Okay, I've got one I'll go Steve first, and then I'll go Gordon next.
Can you hear me, folks?
Yes, we can hear you, Steve.
Right, my question's for Peter. I mean, thanks very much for giving that structural overview on how the Biodiversity Network fits into the potential future ACT government framework. What's the ACT government think about it? How many levers have you got, and what can you do to persuade them that this is not just another overhead of bureaucracy, but the best way to get things happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. So since we have launched the paper, I guess at the paper's launch, we were very happy to see that there was a lot of interest from government. We had Joe Clay come, who is the chair of the planning committee in the government. We also had Peter Kane and Nicole Lauder attend as well. So we've spoke to them all about it directly. We also recently had a meeting with Environment Minister Rebecca Bazzarotti and also with Joe Clay again. So we have been very fortunate to have, I guess, the ear of government on a couple of things with this. There's been a lot of interest in the issue, not just from these political figures, but also from a lot of the people who are working on projects within government, because there's quite a lot of ways that the Biodiversity Network can tie into their work as well. The lever that we see, campaign lever, that we see as being the most promising for this one would be the planning review and reform system. I think the fact that we've had such a positive and warm reception will change the way in which we go about bringing about the Biodiversity Network paper. Sarah, would you like to tap in here as well?
Yes, so we've tried to reach particular groups. We've also had, over the process of actually developing the paper, we have had quite a lot of conversations also with people within government, particularly the environment area, and we've had a lot of support. And really what Peter was saying as well, there's so many programs that if you know, we can fit them all in together, they're all trying to achieve the same thing. So I think that we really have got a lot of support there. The other thing that I was going to say is that where we wrote this paper originally, to feeling that we can tackle this on ACT territory land a lot easier than Commonwealth, but the OECM guidelines give us an opportunity to tap into Commonwealth, because of course that because the states and Commonwealth and territories have signed up to the OECM implementation in some form or another, we can be pushing for this on Commonwealth land and recognising that Commonwealth land is significant managers of a lot of biodiversity. So yeah, we've had tremendous support so far.
Thanks so much for the question, Steve. That was really great. And yeah, echo what Peter and Sarah are saying about the excellent support we've had as well.
Thank you.
I'd like to go to Gordon next for a question. And Alyssa, thank you very much for your comment in the chat. Appreciate your support.
Yeah, thanks, Al. Yeah, no, I just want to congratulate everybody for their work on this. It's really great to see all the depth of analysis and putting forward these proposals. I guess another question, I guess, related to the territory plan. I mean, I've tried to read the new draft territory plan and look at the district strategies, and I know there's this blue-green network that's been included in the territory plan now. But from what I read of it, a lot of it just seems to be about you know, cycle paths or pedestrian routes through the suburbs. They don't seem to be real conservation corridors at all. Obviously the blue is water, you know, we're not dealing with that, but the green corridors. So I guess I'd be interested in Sarah, anybody else's comments, because you mentioned territory plan. I was wondering whether this, you know, how to integrate this biodiversity network into the territory plan, or what do you see as the limitations of what they're proposing with this blue-green network?
Thanks, Gordon. I really agree with you, and I read about the blue-green network with a lot of dismay, actually, particularly as some of the terminology isn't well defined as to what it actually means. I think it's always this difficult thing when you've got terminology, and particularly when you've got new bites of the cherry in terms of yet another expression. I think we've got to be really careful about that, and which is why we're talking more about conservation areas, which are also in the they were identified in the district strategies, not in the territory plan. They weren't defined, but there was a category conservation area, albeit it was only applied on nature reserves. So we've actually done quite a lot of work afterwards with the particularly conservation research area with their connectivity mapping to identify areas that we know of areas of biodiversity importance. That's a OECM terminology, which I quite like. And I think what we really need to do is to actually identify, I'll come into that sort of later, one of the processes that we think is really important is to identify criteria that we can apply to these areas so it's absolutely clear what we're talking about. Does that answer your question? Is that I think blue-green is just, we treat that as a broader category, and within that there's the conservation areas which are more specific.
I might also just chime in here, Sarah. So in our conversations with government, we've found that they've done quite an enormous amount of mapping and recording for the blue-green network and other policies that came in under the territory plan. And the actual mapping that underpins this work is pretty good. It leaves, you know, some room to be desired because, as I'm sure you could understand, mapping the whole urban area of Canberra is an enormous task. But we've found that a lot of that mapping can be used and repurposed into the biodiversity network framework in a way that perhaps this blue-green network policy that can come across a little bit vague has not been able to do.
Just can I put in a supplementary? I mean, one aspect of the blue-green network that concerns me is the wildlife corridors connections, because I think the ACT does quite well in in sort of nominating the nature reserves. Like we've got a lot of declared nature reserves around the ACT, but the connections between them seem quite poor. And I think that's an area we really need to improve. And I'm just wondering how we can actually develop better wildlife corridors to connect the various reserves we have.
That's definitely absolutely critical to this success of this. Exactly what it is, a network. It's not just isolated sites. And I guess that map that I showed sort of demonstrated where a lot of connecting not necessarily totally native vegetation, but vegetation occurs that are corridors and for movement and so on. The Connecting Nature, Connecting People program being undertaken in conservation research is trying to address that as well. So there's a lot of restoration work that's just beginning now in some of those connectivity sites. So that's going to continue. It's a 2-year program, and incidentally, we've FOG has put in a budget submission to try and extend that program, because I think it's a key one there. So yes, the mapping that Peter's talking about is key to that.
Thank you for your questions, Gordon. That was really excellent. And yes, as Sarah said, connectivity is a really key part of the biodiversity network. Do we have any further questions or ideas as well? Are welcome. Yes, Catherine. Hello.
Hi, thank you for this seminar, and I appreciate the also the reminder. And my systems didn't work on my little laptop, so I'm now home and looking at it. I've read the report in brief, and I just have 2 questions. My understanding is the network is both a human network and also a potential ecological network or mosaic of places across the territory. And that's a lovely synergy to be working with as both people and place. Could I ask, has there been any consultation with the ACT farmers by your organisations, plurally, to flesh out how this might work? And because I'm quite involved with the ACT farmers, I don't think there has been. But then, is there something that you guys have in mind, a proposal as to how the network would actually work on farmland? I noticed what's been written in the report on page 15, which is sufficiently vague to allow us all a whole lot of room to move. But are there concrete suggestions as to how it would work?
I'll have a go at that to start with. Yeah, Catherine, as we've discussed, I think it's really important that we work and would like to present to the rural community. I think it would be extremely presumptuous of us to say how we thought it should happen. I think it's only going to work if it comes, anyone who has leasehold is effectively an owner of that land, and to say, I think there's too much imposing on people, and I would hate to see that happening. So I think it's absolutely important that it's voluntary, that it's workable, and that it brings in real benefits to the rural lessees for this to happen. And whether that's under the sort of regenerative farming kind of way of looking at it, where there's potentially higher production benefits and economic benefits through increased lambing and that sort of thing, or whether what I think is important is that this doesn't happen on land unless there's resources that go to farmers, which isn't necessarily just, I will provide some money towards fencing and so on, but is actually on ground help. You know, there's advice, so that we see a sort of a land management team, people who are skilled in in land management, and will go out and help and aid. And, you know, whether they help on the ground or whether they provide advice, it really would be up to the different situation. I've had quite long discussions with, or short discussions with a few rural lessees, and a longer discussion with one particular rural lessee that I've known for a long, long time. And I think what we're hoping is that if we can kind of develop it with the lessees, and we learn over time, and we can work out how to do it, but some sort of a voluntary equivalent of the voluntary conservation covenants that are in New South Wales, so that it isn't imposed. And we're hoping that if some people pick this up and go with it, that other people will see. The most important is that no one sees it as a threat or an imposition in terms of trying to impose other things on their lives. But I have absolutely no doubt that the majority of rural lessees and the urban lessees, we can't forget them, have got areas that have got high biodiversity values that they're very proud of actually having and owning and protecting. So it's actually, we hope it will enhance what's going on now, rather than definitely not disenfranchising them.
Yeah, that sounds great, Sarah. I might just add one very small bit as well. So I guess our main body, which has for consultation, and particularly going forward consulting about the implementation, has been and will continue to be the Biodiversity Conservation Forum, which, Catherine, as you know, the rural lessees have a spot on that. So those of you that don't know, the Biodiversity Conservation Forum is just as it sounds, it's a forum which has community groups and government all in one place, where they can both government and community can bring up their concerns and their issues and their ideas, and we work through agenda items that way. So Sarah will talk about that more lately, but I think that's, I guess, the key mechanism where we would be looking or hoping that engagement would come through.
Okay, great. That is fantastic from both of you. I really appreciate that. And I think before we go to talk to farmers as a group officially, which is opportunity for that is towards the end of June. Our next quarterly meeting is then, and that's going to be held in the government offices, because we're having presentations on a number of issues, and I'd really like this one to be one of those. If we can resolve the where and how this might be happening. So may I suggest that through yourself, Elle, we coordinate a chat to be able to nut out some possible messages for that meeting, to be able to make a proposal to the farmers who attend, and be able to have some succinct examples of how it might work that actually has had endorsement by the Conservator for Flora and Fauna. Because as most of you would know, land management agreements, the LMAs that farmers work under, are a lease requirement, but we also have lease purpose clauses which inhibit and prohibit, in some instances, a whole lot of activities. And the leasing system for farmers is a major impediment for innovation and conservation. And we, as a group, are in discussion with the Conservator and also with the Minister as to how best we can improve that situation through the Capital Food and Fibre Project policy, strategy that's coming, and its attendant action plan, which is coming out before the territory plan is going to be finalised. So there are opportunities to have a conversation with key people to be able to help resolve how it might work, and put a proposal to farmers to see how they might react.
Thank you, Catherine. I've written that down, so taken some notes on that. Thank you for the proposal. I will coordinate for us to keep discussing this, and definitely look to speak at the meeting in June. That may be too soon for some really concrete examples that are supported by the Conservator, but we can all do our best to get there as well. So thank you.
Sorry, and just a sort of a quick point. I think that that's really a really good way of going to actually, if some of us can get together beforehand and nut this out and include the Conservator, because before we go to that meeting, but again, going into that meeting with a very sort of open book as to how it should happen, but definitely I like, well, I don't like the fact that there are clauses that inhibit and prohibit, and I think that's a really important point of which we're starting from, that we have to overcome in order to for people to feel that they're comfortable and trust what can happen.
Yeah.
Agree. And definitely want to do it collaboratively. I think that's a really important point, Sarah, you've been making too.
Yep.
Sorry, I accidentally clicked the next slide. Did we have any further questions? That was some excellent ones from Catherine. I think we will move on to next steps then. Yes, it's 7:15. So thank you everyone so much for the discussion tonight and your contribution as well through those questions was really excellent. I think will only add value and richness and practicality to the Biodiversity Network. So thank you very much for that. Big thank you to our speakers, Sarah, Peter, and Kat, for making the time to speak tonight and to provide those really clear examples and the overviews. And thank you to the three of you for the work that you do to protect and enhance nature and the ACT. It's really very much appreciated. And the three of you I know always go above and beyond, for our nature here. So a big thank you for that and for everything that you give. I'd like to pass now to Sarah to go over the next steps for us. So thank you very much, Sarah.
Okay, thanks, Sal. What I've written down is again a suggestion, and I think that we've got good information to help this process. But I think we have been we're well along the way in terms of communicating, and like the process that you also mentioned, Catherine, to utilise other opportunities where we can do similar or present our ideas to other people. But I think at this stage we really do need a working group, and we would like through Cons Council to invite people from government, landholders and community to be involved in how we actually address some of the actions, instead of, again, not saying, well, the first thing is we need to do this, but how do we, the sorts of actions that we need to address is criteria for the conservation area. So what defines a conservation area? I was actually given access totally coincidentally today at a meeting I went to this morning on some guidelines for criteria for OECMs from Queensland, which may well be very helpful. We're in the process of identifying conservation areas, as I said earlier, with particularly with Conservation Research Group in the environment part of EPSDD. What we need to do, going back to what Peter was saying, is some of those areas could become reserves, nature reserves. They're large enough to sort of fit into that category, such as, say, Mount Rogers, or areas that are alongside existing reserves could be incorporated into those reserves. Others are very small and may need help. We identified that, well, exactly what you're saying, Catherine, that we need to work out how to get the involvement of lessees and get them as a part of this network in a voluntary way. So that needs to be followed through. So maybe a meeting is not, or at least a working group isn't the way of doing it. We need to identify and recognise that there will and may be conflicts between existing land uses and the application of OECMs. The classic one, of course, will be horses, dog walking, recreation, banging a football around versus protection of those areas. So that needs to be addressed. We'll definitely need an education and communication program that goes to neighbours, to the sort of recreation users of those areas. And we need to also look much, much further before being too pushy about the legislative budget and resource implications really need to be considered hard, and so that we do really understand what the resource implications are and the legislative implications are, and get advice on that. And effectively what we need to do is do this as a team so that everyone's on the same page. So that's sort of where we're up to, is really, and that probably would be, but not necessarily introduced through the Biodiversity Conservation Forum, but I think it would be useful within this group, and we had it at the last forum too, any people who would like to be more involved, and particularly, we're looking for a range of skills, and the range of skills is anything from ecological knowledge to legal knowledge to communications experience and working with people, because one of the things that we really put on is important in terms of achieving the biodiversity network is recognition of its importance for well-being, and so there's got to be a lot of different ways that this is approached to really ask people, well, why would you support this and why? And take notice of that. I think the other thing that it sort of came up in some of the talks, or as a sideline, I think, to some of the things that we've been talking about and questions, is we really need to be looking at equitable resourcing right across all tenures, so that at the moment there's a lot of resources that go through Parks and Conservation Service, but not necessarily through other government organisations, and not necessarily on lessees who have this effectively imposed on them because they just happen to have these areas on their land. I think that's all I'd say, but I'd be very keen to, if anybody has any ideas or any other ways that they would say before we try and get stuck into how we trying to implement this.
That was a really excellent summary of next steps, Sarah. Thank you. And as Sarah said, I'm very open to other suggestions around ideas, as well as people, putting their hand up to join that working group. You don't have to have knowledge. Passion is just as important when it comes to protecting nature, and people from all walks of life, and also all backgrounds, everyone's welcome. So I really encourage you all to join in. If that's the case, then you can send a reply email to the one that you would have got about this webinar, probably the most simple way to do that. And then we'd be in touch with the next steps for the working group. But thank you all so much for joining tonight. It was wonderful to have you here, and thank you for your interest. We'll be posting the recording of this webinar onto our website, so you can let people know if they missed tonight. They can always go there and watch it, or if you think that there's decision makers out there who should be watching it, please send them this way, and they can learn more about the Biodiversity Network. And so thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. And thank you for your interest. Oh, Sarah, you've got something else to say.
Always got something else to say, Elle.
Great.
But I think if any of you have got questions that you come up with later, questions or suggestions, they're always welcome. So even if you don't get directly involved, but if you've got anything more that you'd like to provide as input, we'd really very, very seriously like to hear from you, so that we can consider all issues in this process and take note of all of the matters that people raise, because it's tremendously, I've made notes as well, it's tremendously useful to and important to have your input.
Thank you, Sarah. So all suggestions, ideas welcome. It might percolate for you overnight too. And so again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate your interest and participation. So good night, everyone. Bye.